So with the recent success of Resident Evil 4 Remake and the teases we get in that game, it's obvious that we are going to get a Resident Evil 5 Remake whether we want it or not. And if Capcom continues on this trend, it's only a matter of time before we hit that extremely controversial title, Resident Evil 6. Now, while there is the question as to if Resident Evil 6 deserves a second chance, the fact of the matter is, Capcom is heading down that road, it seems, and if it does get to that point, we need to talk about what does Capcom need to do differently to make this game a huge success and not as controversial as the original game. Because whether we admit it or not, and I'm sure a lot of you guys are fans of the original Resident Evil 6, but there are also a lot of fans out there that weren't happy with that. Resident Evil 6 is without a doubt, in my mind, the most controversial game in the franchise. And for me personally, and this is just my opinion, but is the worst mainline entry in the Resident Evil franchise. So Capcom really needs to dig deep and figure out what do they need to do differently with this game if they decide to give it the remake treatment. And that's what I want to focus on with this episode of Nerdspace Games. I'm going to dive down into Resident Evil 6, kind of dig deep and figure out what were the things that were truly wrong with this game. What issues did Resident Evil 6 have? And then make a list of 10 different elements that I feel like Capcom can change and help improve the game for a remake. So my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and here are my top 10 things that Capcom needs to change for the Resident Evil 6 remake. Also, side note, before I move any farther with this video, I want to point out that this list is in no particular order. As a matter of fact, it's kind of just putting it in the order that flows best, but this is all just my opinion. Without further ado though, let's get to today's video. Number 1, survival horror. So before I move forward with this topic, I just want to mention that I did do a video earlier on in this week regarding survival horror as a genre and what it takes to make a good survival horror game. Check that video out. I'll put the link to that in the description, as well as having that video at the end of this one for you to go check out if you want. But the main reason why I'm bringing this up is because I feel like Resident Evil 6 and even Resident Evil 5 took a huge departure from the survival horror genre. I still feel like Resident Evil 4 was kind of still somewhat in that wheelhouse, but Resident Evil 5 went full-blown action horror versus survival horror. And I think that was a mistake. Don't get me wrong, I actually enjoyed Resident Evil 5. I don't think it's a bad game at all, but it did kind of set the stepping stones for the path that led to Resident Evil 6. Resident Evil established the survival horror genre. So it's weird whenever you see a game establish a specific genre, created the genre of survival horror, all of a sudden decided once it departs from that and kind of go to Michael Bay style video games now. It was a huge punch to the gut to a lot of us old school survival horror fans. And I think while it doesn't need to go back into those tank control style Resident Evil gameplay, it does need to kind of dig back into that original survival horror roots just a little bit. A perfect example would be Resident Evil 2 Remake. Resident Evil 2 Remake still had the over-the-shoulder mode, the over-the-shoulder third-person mode where it still worked for a survival horror game. And while people might like the original better, the fact of the matter is that game still did a great job at helping us experience survival horror as a whole. Resident Evil 6 could go into that territory, but even if Capcom doesn't want to turn Resident Evil 6 into a full-blown survival horror game, it can at least take some of the traits and bring it into Resident Evil 6 Remake, and you can get something similar to Resident Evil 4 Remake. I feel like there was some horror elements and traits that kind of helped it feel more survival horror, while still also kind of leaning towards the action horror as well. And I might prefer the survival horror games versus the action horror games. For example, Resident Evil 4 Remake is probably my number 5 best Resident Evil game, while Resident Evil 2 Remake is like my 3rd best favorite video game of the franchise. It's still a way to appease both the action horror and survival horror fans if you can just find that happy medium like Resident Evil 4 did. And before a lot of you guys start hitting up that keyboard saying that Resident Evil 6 was a top seller, yes, it made a lot of money. It didn't do bad in terms of the money making. and that the survival horror genre is dead and it won't make it money, well, you know that's completely out the door now, because Capcom did announce that Resident Evil 2 Remake is now the highest selling Resident Evil game ever. And that game is full-blown survival horror. Actually, it's modern survival horror, because that game released in 2019. 4 years ago, that game released, and it is now the best-selling Resident Evil game. That game is a perfect example of a survival horror game that took modern mechanics and made it work, and it was extremely successful. And if Resident Evil 6 can learn from that, then we could get a really good Resident Evil 6 remake. Number 2, no time jumps. Okay, so I am kind of gonna go back a little bit on what I just said just now, and that is the fact that it's okay to have maybe a small time jump or one time jump throughout the entire game. Hell, I think flashbacks are extremely important to the Resident Evil story. So I don't think there's anything wrong with flashbacks or having a time jump here and there. However, the problem with Resident Evil 6 is that I felt like they got a little too trigger happy with it, because 2 of the campaigns in Resident Evil 6 had a 6-month time jump. A 6-month time jump, to the point where 2 of the characters were missing for literally 6 months. And while it's kind of sort of explained to me, it doesn't really make a lot of logical sense how all of these different things kind of played out perfectly with the right timing. It just, yeah, it doesn't make sense at all in my opinion. And I feel like when it comes to the Resident Evil universe, the time jumps are not necessarily. I think a Resident Evil game needs to focus on a small, specific time frame. Usually 1 day is ideal when you look at specific Resident Evil titles like Resident Evil 1, Resident Evil 2, but it's okay to have some games last a few different days, like Resident Evil Code Veronica actually lasts a few days. But there wasn't no significant time jump in these games, and that's why I felt like it was easier to kind of establish an atmospheric horror, which I personally feel like is a extremely important part of a survival horror experience. Whenever you have those time jumps, it's hard to kind of establish the setting a little bit more, and it's kind of harder to establish the atmospheric horror and the characters and all of these things combined, because you take one moment and then you jump into the future, and then you're expecting the characters to kind of be somewhat the same 6 months later. It's confusing, and I don't think it's needed. I do think flashbacks are needed to kind of explain the story a little bit more, but I don't think we need the time jump. So I feel like Resident Evil 6 could do better with its remake if they just don't have those time jumps like they did in the original Resident Evil 6. Number 3, a single area or location. So to kind of bounce off of the time jumps, something that is going to help with that is to make sure that Resident Evil 6 Remake focuses on a specific location or area. Do not do what Resident Evil 6 originally did, and that is put all of these different characters into different places all over the world and have them travel all around the world throughout Resident Evil 6. Because that, my friends, sounded like a full-blown action Michael Bay movie. That did not sound like a Resident Evil game. And I think that was one of the biggest problems with Resident Evil 6, is that instead of taking a small contained area and focusing on that area and having the characters kind of build up and interact with each other in that area, they decided to go worldwide and have the characters travel from America to China, and it was just all over the place in my opinion. And because they wanted the characters to interact, they had to explain why it worked out perfectly for all of these characters to end up in China all at the same time, despite them going on different paths, which I think was explained well enough, but to me it was just a little bit messy. And I feel like if this was done in a better way, where maybe the entire game kind of took place in one specific area, it would make more sense for these characters to arrive at specific points at the same time, because they're already in this area throughout the entire game. So I'm going to give you guys a situation that I think would play out for Resident Evil 6 Remake. Let's take a setting from Resident Evil 6 itself, Tall Oaks. It is the fictional city that the Ivy University was located at in the events of Leon's beginning Chapter 1 campaign. So let's take that location. What if the entire Tall Oaks was infected? Like there was an outbreak like we saw in Tall Oaks. So around the city there was different outbreaks of zombies and monsters all over the city now. Great, fantastic. How can we focus a whole game on this kind of environment, on this story. Well, Leon and Helena, obviously it's already established that they were there because they were there protecting the president. So it's already explained why their characters are there. Sherry Birkin is also an agent, so it makes sense why her character could be there. But actually, something that I think would make even more sense is, what if Simmons is testing on Sherry Birkin and Jake because of their abilities, their unique abilities that they have. And as for Chris, after the outbreak, Chris and his team with the BSAA could be sent there to handle all of the different BOWs and help rescue civilians and get them out of the city. Boom, problem solved. Now you have a way where you just brought all 6 main protagonists into one location. And now that you have that established, you don't really need to go all the way to China. You just focus on this town of Tall Oaks, which, by the way, in my opinion, if done right, there's a lot to work with. Yes, I get there are a lot of similarities to Raccoon City, but having a full town dedicated to a game where you can go to maybe the hospital, the church, the university, even explore that a little bit more, a police station. There's so much things you can add within this city of Tall Oaks. You can add different elements to, and then you can have the different campaigns go to all of these different locations, and you have a much more contained story that doesn't need time jumps, that doesn't need traveling across the world to tell. And that's what I mean. That's why I think the location is so important when it comes to the survival horror game, because if done wrong, like we saw with Resident Evil 6, it could be kind of a clusterfuck. Number 4, non-linear or semi-open world. So I told you at the beginning of the video that if you want to check out my survival horror video talking about the different traits that are important to a survival horror game, well, I'm going to bounce off of that again, because this is actually something I brought up in that video, and that is the fact that I feel like survival horror games really need the backtracking and the exploration of a survival horror experience. Like, you need to be able to go and explore and find rewards and items that can be used to your advantage as you're going around the map. However, something that Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6 all did differently that made it kind of stretch into the action horror genre and away from the survival horror genre is that they decided to kind of get rid of that semi-open world, non-linear path that they had. The original games and even the remakes of 2 and 3, we saw the players being able to go throughout the game in any order they see fit. Like, you can get a key, like an armor key in Resident Evil 1 remake, that opens like 4 or 5 different doors. However, there's no specific order that you have to open those doors, and you find yourself backtracking and going to locations specifically just to get more ammunition or healing items for the next boss fight coming up. You don't really get that at all with Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6. You get a little tease of it in Resident Evil 4 Remake with the lake, and you also get a little tease of it in Resident Evil 5 with, ironically, a swamp area. But you don't really get it that much more outside of those elements. And I feel like Resident Evil kind of needs to go back into that atmosphere, because that was one of the most cool and unique things that I felt like the original Resident Evil games did really well, is that it made it feel like it was a semi-open world. It wasn't semi-open world, but it made it feel like it by allowing that backtracking and exploration throughout different areas that you find yourself coming back to once you have the right tools to get through a specific room or window or something like that. Number 5, no co-op. Okay, so I am going to make this as short as I can possibly make this part, because I already know people are not going to be happy with this part, or at least most people are not going to be happy with this, and that is the fact that I don't think Resident Evil 6 needs to be co-op. I'm sorry, there you go, I said it. In my opinion, survival horror games, if they really want to stick to those survival horror roots, you can't make a survival horror experience if you have a second player joining you. It takes a lot of the anxiety and fear and horror out of the atmosphere when you're playing with a friend. And I know that is pretty messed up, and I know there's a lot of people that love playing the Resident Evil games with a friend. I feel like having a partner throughout the entire game makes the experience just a little bit more reassuring. And that's fine for specific types of games, but if you're trying to go back to those survival horror roots, then getting away from the co-op experience is ideal. Now, you could have segments with an AI partner every now and then. That's okay. For example, Resident Evil 4 actually did a really good job at this with its remake. And I feel like if you're stuck with a partner throughout a good chunk of the story, then it makes the experience a little bit more relaxing. Resident Evil 0 is another example I can think of. Whenever you have Billy with you consistently, it kind of takes a lot of the fear and tension out of it. Don't get me wrong, I like Resident Evil 0 more than most people do actually, but having that partner mechanic constantly with you, it does take a little of the fear out of the game. But I'll leave it at that because I know I'm already going to get a lot of heat and hate for this one. But let me know, do you guys want Resident Evil 6 Remake to be a co-op game? And actually, on that note, do you think Resident Evil 5 Remake is going to be a co-op game, or do you think they're going to get rid of that co-op feature? Because I think they're not going to make that a co-op experience. I'm calling it right now. Number 6, bring back the damn puzzles. Okay, so Resident Evil 4 was probably the last game that kind of did this in the series, although there wasn't a lot of it. However, Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6 were complete departures from this element, and that is the fact that you don't really have puzzles in those games. Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6 felt like it was better to go the full-blown action route, and that people really didn't care about the puzzle solving anymore. And that's a huge issue for me because one of my favorite parts about survival horror games are the puzzles. I still remember playing the original Silent Hill game and trying to figure out those riddle-based puzzles, trying to think outside the box on how to solve them. But the point is that I really like the puzzles in survival horror games, and when you take them out of my favorite franchises, it really breaks my heart. So yes, I want Resident Evil 6 Remake to kind of dive down back into the puzzles, bring more puzzles. They don't have to be overly complicated, they don't have to be over the top. I was fine with the amount of puzzles I got in Resident Evil 4 Remake. That was okay. It wasn't to the level that I wanted it, but at least I got a little bit taste of it instead of Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6 completely taking them away from me. So please, Resident Evil 6 Remake, Capcom, do not forget the puzzles. Make sure you bring us more puzzles in that game, please. Number 7, 2 playable campaigns plus an Ada campaign. So here's another hot take. I felt like Resident Evil 6 had way too many campaigns, and I felt like there was way too many playable characters. Here's how I personally would like to see the campaigns in Resident Evil 6 Remake. These are the changes I would like to see. So first off, I think the 2 main campaigns need to be Chris and Leon. You're taking 2 of the biggest protagonists of the Resident Evil franchise and bringing them together. So of course, both of these characters have to be in this game. However, I don't think we need a campaign devoted to Jake and Sherry. I do think they should be in the game, but I'm gonna go over that a little bit later on when I start talking about one of the other things on this list. But I think for the most part, the campaign needs to focus on Leon, and then another campaign needs to focus on Chris. They're both going to take place in Tall Oaks, like I mentioned earlier, but we're going to see them interacting with each other. We're going to see them interacting with some of the supporting characters, which I feel like is how you get all of those other characters involved in the story without making them playable. People like Helena, Pierce, I mentioned Sherry and Jake earlier on. I'll talk about them later, but people like them, they don't need to be a full-blown playable character. I think they can have supporting moments. For example, maybe Leon gets a specific part and Helena needs to help him with that part, kind of similar to how you use Ada in Resident Evil 2 Remake during Leon's campaign. Something like that would be okay. However, I don't think we need a full game, a full campaign playable with Helena and Pierce. That's just my opinion. I think if you just focus on Chris and Leon, so that way they can go off by themselves and they can come and meet up with Pierce and Helena throughout the story, but not fully play with them throughout the entire story, I think that's ideal. Number 8, the story. Okay, so without a doubt, the story needs to be more concise. The story for Resident Evil 6 is probably one of the more confusing stories of the franchise, and it's probably the most over-the-top, crazy Michael Bay level stories of the series. I mean, it goes pretty insanely crazy with its story elements, and I think that was a huge problem with the original game. Actually, one of the biggest problems is the fact that there were too many stories going on all at the same time, and it kind of made things a mess. It was like a complete mess. I think one of the biggest ways you can solve that issue is, like I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the playable campaigns, just focus on Leon and Chris. I mentioned that another way you can fix this issue is focusing on a smaller setting. Maybe just make it one location instead of it being all over the world. Stuff like that can definitely help the story be a little bit more concise and less confusing. focusing on maybe one main antagonist, kind of doing everything on his own, is probably easier than trying to have like 4 different main antagonists going throughout the game. In the original Resident Evil 6, you had Carla, you had Simmons, you had the Usta Stink? I don't know how to pronounce that thing's name, but you had that monster. Number 9, main antagonists and other enemies. Okay, so I touched on this when I was talking about the story, but you need to focus on the boss enemies, the main antagonists, and the other enemies of the game. So first off, I prefer my zombies. I love my zombies. If you don't want to go that route, you want to go the route towards the Las Plagas, that's fine too. However, you don't need to do anything crazy. You don't have to stick to the zombies. You can do something a little bit more unique if you want, but just make sure you don't go over the top with the action side of things. I felt like that while the Las Plagas was kind of still in the right realm of survival horror, whenever you got to the Ouroboros or Resident Evil 6, all those different variants that you get with monsters, it kind of gets crazy whenever they can shoot guns at you. I think that goes a little too far in my opinion. I don't know, let me know what you think. Still, Resident Evil 6 can really do whatever they want with the monsters. They can go to the classic monsters like Lickers, Hunters. They can create new ones, that's fine too. But what's really important in my opinion that they need to focus on are the boss fights, because the boss fights, it needs a little bit more innovation. I think some ideas you could definitely make Simmons the main antagonist for Leon's campaign still. Chris's main antagonist, I actually have a crazy theory that maybe Jake somehow gets turned into a monster at the end and he's the main boss, or even Pierce. Him having to go up against Pierce as the main antagonist would be an amazing boss fight for Chris. But I think the most important thing we have to do, and I mentioned this earlier, and I know there are some fans of this character, but Carla needs to go. She was completely anime level type of character in a Resident Evil survival horror game, and to me, her character does not make sense for this type of style of game. If you're a Carla fan, hit up the comments and tell me how much you hate me right now. From a level 1 to 10, how much you hate me right now. But number 10 is the gameplay. Okay, so this probably isn't as big of a deal because actually the gameplay wasn't too bad in the original Resident Evil 6. That was probably one of the more shining moments. The combat, the way you move, stuff like that, it was actually a lot more fluent when you compare it to Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 4. However, it definitely could use some of the modern mechanics and changes to help improve it a little bit. Kind of go back into the vein of Resident Evil 4 Remake actually. I think that's the perfect combination for these modern survival horror-ish type games, is to have those type of mechanics. So what I mean by that, obviously you have to be able to move and aim, which I think if I remember correctly you are able to do in Resident Evil 6. That was actually probably one of the first Resident Evil games that allowed you to do that. But also add some of the mechanics from the remake of Resident Evil 4, like the knife combat. I think that's one of the coolest things that they added to Resident Evil. I love the combat system that you get in Resident Evil 4 Remake, how you can block weapons, you can counter, you can do some really insane stealth attacks with it. It's really, really cool, and I love that they came up with the durable meter for the knives, so that way you can't just use them willingly. You have to choose the right moments to use them, otherwise they'll break and you have to fix them or get new ones. That was really cool. If you take some of those mechanics, take some of the smoothness and fluentness of the gameplay for Leon and Resident Evil 4 Remake, and you take that and you bring that over to Resident Evil 6 Remake, I think you have perfect gameplay in my opinion. I think that is perfect just the way it is. I mentioned that I don't want co-op, so I want that out the door. I don't mind an AI partner for specific segments, kind of similar to what we got with Luis and Leon in Resident Evil 4 Remake. That's okay in my opinion. Oh, and probably the most important of all, I think you gotta get rid of that popping pills type mechanic that you had for healing items in Resident Evil 6 Remake. That was the dumbest thing I've ever seen Resident Evil do. Please get that the hell out of there. I don't like that at all. Other than that, not bad. It's fine as is. Just take those ideas that you had with Resident Evil 4 Remake, incorporate them into Resident Evil 6 Remake, and you got good gameplay in my opinion. But that's gonna do it for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Guys, hit up the comments, let me know what you guys think about my opinions as to what Resident Evil 6 needs to do differently for the remake. Also, hit up the comments and let me know if you think Resident Evil 6 will get a remake and should get a second chance. I'd love to know your opinions, as always, in the comments below, so go ahead, leave those comments. Anyways, if you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button for more gaming content Share this video with your friends and family, and hit that like button if you enjoyed this video, or that dislike button if you disagreed with just about everything I said. And as always guys, I will see you on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.